Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Some people think really that Christians should be apart from politics, or that if one is a religious person that you don't get involved in that dirty world of political action and so on. And I really think that is a mistake. I would think that the Christian person, based on the gospel, ought to be more involved in the political process, because we realize that that is where the kingdom of God is being established.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Thomas Landgraf, a member of the Religion Department at Central Catholic High School. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the new Christian right. Here's Father Bacik.
Tom, I'm glad that you're here to discuss some serious matters. We've had some good discussions on other occasions, and I look forward to this one. I'd like to raise the whole question of the new Christian right, often identified with a political type organization. Greater interest in politics. I suppose the one group in that whole movement that people know best is the moral majority, led by Jerry Falwell. I think most people identify the movement with him, although it certainly is much wider than that. There are other groups around the country who partake of that. I guess the new Christian right believes that Christian people today in the United States need to organize themselves politically so that they can have influence on the state level, in the legislatures, in the Congress, and in electing the man for president that they want. They certainly are very involved in the whole thing. In the last election, a lot of those people claim to be a major force in the election of President Reagan, and many of them claimed that they were behind the defeat of many of the so-called liberal senators, like Senator George McGovern or Birch Bayh or Frank Church, those people. Remember some of the dialogues after the elections where those people made it pretty clear that they thought they were a major influence, and that other candidates who did not go along with their viewpoints really should look out, and they've already begun to target certain people for the next elections, and are indicating that if people don't live up to certain of their standards, that they will be out to try to defeat them. I think they had some of the conservatives had strong words even for Vice President Bush right after the election, putting him on alert that they would be watching him, and that extended to the president himself. And I noticed recently some of these people in a major meeting were beginning to speak harsh words about President Reagan and saying they didn't like too much what he was doing in his early appointments and in beginning his policies. So that when we're talking about the new Christian right, we're talking about Christian people who are organizing themselves for political action, and often identified with the moral majority and with that individual leader, Jerry Falwell.
I feel a little bit like Patrick Henry. I may not agree with much of what the moral majority says, but one thing I do feel rather strongly is they have every right to organize. They have every right to be politically active. They have every right to make known their views on a variety of issues, and I think they have every right to, obviously, to vote the way they want to vote. And rather than be critical of them on that level, I think perhaps a far healthier response would be for those who oppose them to organize themselves.
Yes, I think we've had an overreaction on the part of liberals in that regard. Many liberals were upset with the fact that they were organizing in this way, and I think the moral majority people were responding, well, you've had your National Council of Churches and your more liberal organizations for years trying to lobby Congress and to get certain laws passed and so on, and why can't we do this? And I think they're right. In fact, I would like to see that in a very positive way, as you suggested. Maybe it will galvanize other Christians into action, and many who have become apathetic see now that it might be possible to influence what goes on. And I think that really is a Christian duty. Some people think really that Christians should be apart from politics, or that if one is a religious person that you don't get involved in that dirty world of political action and so on. And I really think that is a mistake. I would think that the Christian person, based on the gospel, ought to be more involved in the political process, because we realize that that is where the kingdom of God is being established. And we realize that structures are very important in people's lives, and that we are so influenced by the kind of system in which we live. And if there's injustice woven into our institutions and our society, that people are going to be hurt in so many ways. And put positively, that if we intend to create a more just society, then we've got to look to the institutional and societal and structural factors and to try to improve them. So I feel, as you do, that rather than decry the entrance of these people into the political arena, one ought to think in terms of how one might respond. Now, of course, you and I are both speaking out of a different perspective. I mean, we're not aligned with the moral majority of the New Christian Right, and we speak out of, I suppose, a more liberal kind of tradition and a different approach to Christian politics. And so that should be kept in mind as we go through our discussion here. I was thinking of a positive kind of response that George McGovern is making. He's founding now this Citizens for Common Sense, in which his reaction to his own defeat was to say, okay, now the liberals must organize themselves in a new way, must learn the techniques that these people use successfully, their mailing-type campaigns, their grassroots organization, and so on. And I think that this represents one kind of response. Now, that's not out of a theological or religious framework, but out of a political one. But I think I've heard rumors that some theologians feel that they want to be more involved next time around. I believe I read something that the historian Martin Marty was saying that he hadn't been consulted much in the last election, and I had an indication in what he was writing that he intended to be more active the next time around. So maybe we already see signs that this is happening. And such competition can only be for the good. It's what our whole system is based on, really.
I think, too, we ought to recognize that the moral majority must have touched something deep within people. There is an appeal there. And I'm not sure that the appeal is totally a bad one. And probably there's some good to it. And I think as one who... So I say, you're right, I'm not aligned with the moral majority, but as one who can just sort of survey the scene and say that now they had a message that people listened to. And there must be something good in that message. And it's up to me now to figure out what that message is precisely, and perhaps then to refine it, to work with it, or to interpret it a bit differently. But I think we have to be conscious that, by golly, they did succeed in appealing to something that people wanted to hear.
Touched a responsive chord in many people. They claim that they have something like 60 million evangelical Christians in the United States that they are trying to organize. Now, that is a potent political force. There's no doubt about it. I think a good representation of this whole movement is found in Jerry Falwell's book, Listen, America, which he published in 1980 before the election. And in there, Falwell argues, generally in this fashion, he will look at a segment of our society, and, for example, the music, the rock and roll, or pornography, or the abortion question, the economics, defense policy, and so on. And his general approach is to say, look how bad this is. You know, we're really going down the drain in this question. You know, he'll take abortion, for example, or the question of strong defense. And he will cite all the ways in which the country is not doing well on this. Mm-hmm. Then he will come on with what he would call a Christian solution to this. He will say what Christians ought to hold about this based on a very literal reading of the Bible. And then he will say, let's gather around this cause. Let's do something about it. And I think there's a great appeal in that, really. There is a sense that there's a clear-cut problem, and here's a clear, precise answer out of the Christian Scriptures, and now, gang, we got a cause to fight for. And I believe that approach has a power in itself, because very often other people analyzing the ills see it in a more nuanced way. It's a little gray. It's not all that clear. And other Christians will be saying, hey, we don't know if we got a clear answer to this problem. And it begins to sound very wishy-washy in a sense, where the message of Jerry Falwell in that book and much of what we heard from the New Christian Right really was clear-cut and definitive. And people said, yeah, that's good, and I can rally around it.
Sounds to me, though, that you're saying that people, maybe human beings, tend to be a bit uncomfortable with complexity, and when simplicity is offered, there is a great temptation to go with it, even though I think all of us sense deep in our hearts that life is complex, and there are not easy answers, and there's always a matter of gray in a lot of areas. But we don't like to think about that. Maybe because it's a lot of hard work when you think about it that way. It's a lot easier.
I think we'd have to sell that idea, though. I mean, I think that's one of the first criticisms I would make of the New Christian Right, is that it's simplistic, that the problems aren't as simple as they claim, nor are the solutions as clear-cut. And I think that maybe one job of Christians who are taking another attitude would be to say that we must intelligently work our way through these problems. We have to learn to live with a certain amount of complexity in the world. We have to make coalitions with people who maybe think differently from what we do on many of these issues. I think we would have to sell that kind of thing. But as you say, it goes against much of the grain psychologically, because all of us want to have a simple solution to the problems that plague us.
I guess what I began to say, too, is it's hard work when you deal with complexity. It's hard work to make, for example, a moral decision on any issue. If you really figure out all the possible alternatives and all the possible goods and bads, and you put that all together, I think sometimes I'm lazy and I don't really want to do all that. And if somebody would just tell me what to do, I wouldn't have to do all that.
So much easier, isn't it?
So much easier.
Yes.
And of course, we live in a time where the Catholic Church has sort of tended to move away from that kind of authoritarian telling everybody what to do. And some of us sometimes are left and we're not too sure about how to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I think that in making a good Christian response to that, we have to say that there are certain clear things that as Christians we hold on to. There are certain values here of the equality of all people, the dignity of every human being, the importance of the law of love, the possibility of social sin, of injustice embedded in institutions. All of that I think we need to fall back on, that there is a God running this world, that any sort of self-contained humanism is wrong, that anything that wants to limit man to just what is empirically verifiable is not going to make it, and that there's a certain justice that needs to be present in international relationships and so on. I think all of that would be necessary for Christians who want to give a positive response out of a more liberal tradition to bring forth. I think we ought to look, too, at some of the specific things that they say, because so we're not just leaving this discussion vague. So we're talking about the New Christian Right, the moral majority, and so on. And in Falwell's book, he makes clear some of the things that he's trying to deal with. He says that he's for more defense spending, for example. That and he claims that the Bible in nowhere contradicts this. He says that nowhere in the Bible is there a rebuke for the bearing of armaments. So it's all right for us to arm more. He's pro-Israel, very much so, because Israel really is God's chosen people. He's opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment because, and he says that must be defeated because it defies the mandate, as we find in the Scriptures, that the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church. So he thinks that ERA must be defeated on that biblical basis, as we find in the 5th chapter of Ephesians. Wives, be subject to your husbands. He's against abortion, claims that the Bible clearly teaches that life begins at conception. Homosexuality is a sin in his mind. Just that tendency, sexual tendency, is a sin in itself, and he's against giving gay rights and so on. Very often these people in general now are against what they call humanism. Humanism is the big thing that you read about all the time that they're opposed to. But humanism means for them a self-contained system that puts man in the center of things, that leaves no room for transcendence, for God in the world, that makes man the measure of man, as the Greeks said a long time ago. And in this way, they feel that that's what is subverting the Christian values. For them, capitalism is the only system that really counts. Falwell says, actually, in a quote here, the free enterprise system is clearly outlined in the book of Proverbs. So he thinks that our capitalistic system, our free enterprise system, is biblically based and mandated for us by the Scriptures. Now that gives us a little concrete feel for what these people are saying to us.
I think by way of response, there are two thoughts that emerged right away in my thinking. One is to refute that means that I or somebody else has to go back and read some of those scriptures and to try and determine exactly what the author did mean. And of course that means hard work, because it's not always so clear. It requires study, it requires effort, it requires going to classes maybe, it requires guidance, it requires reading commentaries. All of that is hard work. Now, a lot of people, and myself included, sometimes we just don't really want to do it.
Tom, before you go on to your second point, let's stay with that one for a minute, okay? You might forget the other one by the time we get to it, but I mean, I think that I agree with you. I think that in a sense, the biblical fundamentalism that lays behind their position must be attacked in some ways. And I think the general kind of answer is to say that the Scriptures do not give us that kind of clear blueprint for solving our current problems. The Scriptures were written a long time ago in another culture and in another setting. And we can't expect them to be giving answers to modern problems that are rooted in a whole different set of cultural and historical circumstances. So that is a general kind of answer, I think, that we must give. I think that really when you get down to some of the specific things, where he says there's nothing in the Scriptures against armaments, but there is a whole idea of he who takes up the sword will perish by the sword. There certainly is a pacifism. Jesus refused to join the zealot group, which wanted to violently overthrow the Romans. So there seems to be a whole preaching of nonviolence in there. At least that's in the Scriptures and would have to be brought forth against Falwell. I think the ERA thing, again, I believe that it's really short-sighted to say that because the Scriptures say wives be subject to their husbands, that one has to be against ERA. I don't see the connection at all. It also says that in Christ there's neither male nor female, and is suggesting that there is a fundamental equality between men and women in the eyes of Jesus Christ and in a proper ordering of things. So that I believe that Paul was speaking out of his own period and was culturally conditioned in a society where women were really put down in many ways. I think it is simply wrong to say that the Bible promotes the capitalistic system. You could argue just as well from the Acts of the Apostles and say, look, they had everything in common. They were all to give into the common pot. It says that. It's a communal kind of living. You could say, see, the Scriptures favor communism. Well, I think either thing is equally false. The Scriptures simply aren't favoring either modern capitalism or Soviet Marxist communism. It simply is a different setting. So I believe that this is something that ought to be avoided. That whole fundamentalist approach to the Scriptures must be challenged. And so when they come on and say this is the Christian position and the only one, I think that simply isn't true. A good Christian obviously can be in support of ERA. And no matter what Jerry Falwell is claiming on that regard.
Well, the second point, which I didn't forget, was that the things that the Gospels are so clear about, I think, sometimes threaten our lifestyle. The Gospels are very clear that Jesus loved the poor, and he went out of his way to take care of them and to be with them and to help them in any way that he could. And I think that's very clear. I mean, there's no hard work to figure that out. It's there and as clear as one can make it. And yet we don't like to think about that because I consider myself not poor. And if I'm challenged to help the poor, maybe I won't be quite as rich as I am now. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to make that change. So I conveniently sort of ignore the clarity in the gospel there and prefer perhaps to go to other aspects of it.
It's interesting that in all the literature on the New Christian Right, you seldom see much written about the disadvantaged in our society, about the aged people, the people who are struggling in one way or another. There's not much said about that. The people that it does speak strongly about are the unborn human beings. And I think from our own perspective, we could applaud that and say, we gather with the new Christian right on that particular point and say, we're happy to have you aboard, and we think that there needs to be respect for human life across the board. But one challenges them to say, where is the concern for the social programs? Where is the real effort to deal with the disadvantaged in our culture? How do they plan to help out the elderly who are having it so difficult these days? People on fixed incomes. What are they saying about that? I think there really is a notable lack on that point. And the other thing is that in promoting candidates, and this is going to be happening in future elections, very often it was a single issue that they would zero in on. And they would say, if this man is not tremendously anti-abortion, then we're not going to be for them. He might have a very humane attitude on many other things, on peace and war, fighting hard for peace, against capital punishment, for example, in favor of helping the disadvantaged and the elderly. And yet much of that would be set aside. And the new Christian right would zero in on the one issue of abortion, or maybe prayer in the schools, and say, okay, we're going to be against this candidate on these grounds. I know there's been many religious leaders in the United States who said that this is bad political kind of action, that candidates ought to be judged on a broad range of issues and not just one particular issue.
Yeah, it seems like we're at times defeating a person who might hold 15 Christian values, and we're defeating him because he or she doesn't hold one that we're terribly interested in. It's a little short-sighted from a Christian point of view. But I agree. I think that's what happened at times. And I think I still believe sometimes we're afraid to look at the whole Christian context because we find it so threatening to ourselves, so threatening to the way we have lived and the way we have been taught is such a good way to live. And I put myself very much in that category. I'm right there.
I think all of us, yes, who live the good middle-class life in a way, could feel threatened by trying the gospel imperative that we must be concerned with the poor. And therefore we're going to have to find a way, positively, as more liberal Christians, I think, to somehow figure out how to make that attractive. I don't know how we do that. I mean, I take it that's going to be one of the great problems in the coming years, to say, how do we really engage people in the social apostolate? How do we convince ourselves and others that we must be working in behalf of these poor people? Tom, we're watching the time a bit here, and I want to get to another point that Falwell keeps bringing up, and that is what he calls his pro-American stance. And he's very much in favor of the United States and its greatness. And one of his major theological points on this is that America is great because it has been good. That because we were faithful to the gospel message for many years, therefore God has allowed us to prosper. Again, difficult as it may seem, I think that needs to be challenged from a theological perspective. In the biblical perspective, it simply is not true that good people are rewarded and bad people are punished in a socio-economic way. That link has been cut in the Christian tradition. And yet we carry that around with us very often. It's playing to one of the myths that's in our culture, that those poor people who are disadvantaged and living in ghettos are there because they're lazy or because they're bad. And good people who are living in the suburbs and got it made are simply being rewarded for their sacrifice, hard work, and effort. And I think that simply isn't correct. The United States has prospered because we've had this rich continent. And because our capitalistic system has functioned the way it has. I mean, there are other reasons for our prospering. And Falwell keeps saying that we'll only prosper and things will get better when we get back to the Bible and to being believing people and so on. And I believe that whole perception really must be challenged in many ways. What we have to see is that there needs to be a care and compassion for those in the world who are less fortunate. In our Catholic tradition, we've had great statements on this from our popes in the 20th century, that there has to be a just structure among the nations of the world, that the richer nations must be looking out for the poorer nations. So it's not a matter of just looking out for ourselves and moving ourselves forward. But it's that theological link that I think is wrong. I don't find Falwell or these other people willing to use their biblical principles to criticize our capitalistic system and whatever greed might be in it or excesses. I think it's important for us Christians to realize that our faith is not tied to one economic system. One does not have to be favor of the free enterprise system because one is a Christian. One can be a Christian socialist, for example, as we have many good ones in our world like that. So we are not tied to one economic or political system as Christian believers. I always like to use that phrase, which I learned from a very conservative Catholic, Brent Bozell, who was editing Triumph magazine years ago, that the cross must be judge of the flag. That really Christianity gives us a higher basis from which we must judge the good and the bad in any political and economic system. Therefore, we must look at the system we have and see all the good things about it, the freedom that it has brought people, and the great wealth that has been accumulated in the United States as a result, and the many people who have been fed because this system seems to work well. But on the other hand, we have to be ready to criticize it too, and to speak about ways in which it might be exploiting other people and so on. So I think there's so many substantive issues, Tom, that we haven't touched on. But what is important is to realize that the moral majority doesn't have the whole field of Christian involvement. There really is another viewpoint.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Thomas Landgraf, a member of the Religion Department at Central Catholic High School. The topic of this week's Reflections was the New Christian Right. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.